environmental justice extends far beyond just water. It's the number of trucks driving down your street. It's the pollution in your air, the oil seeping through your backyard. So there are a lot of organizations working on this. A quick Google search will make a lot pop up. But engage your local representatives. We had a new, today's Tuesday, yesterday, just on Monday, we had a new district attorney formally installed here in Los Angeles, and George Gascon, is going to focus on environmental justice. Get engaged with his office. They're going to begin prosecuting these polluters who are the root cause of this injustice environmentally. So get engaged with your local representatives. I think that's the most impactful way to take any of the memos we wrote here or any one idea you may have and try to do good for your community.
Welcome to the official podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. In this podcast, students and early career researchers share more about their publication in the journal. Join us weekly to hear from the next generation of STEM leaders as we elevate their voices in science, technology, and innovation policy. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode of SciPol SoundBites, a podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. I'm Adriana Bankston, JSPG's Chief Outreach Officer and your host for this podcast. Today, we continue with episodes from the joint issue between JSPG and the National Science Policy Network, resulting from the 2020 Policy Memo Competition. Authors we are interviewing today are graduate students discussing important topics related to water policy, healthcare, with a focus on community. So let's talk a little bit about each publication. So we'll start with Connor. Connor Philson is a PhD student in ecology and evolutionary biology at UCLA. His current work broadly focuses on the fitness consequences of social behavior and its implications for evolution and conservation. He holds a BS in biology from Radford University and is the current vice president of the science policy group at UCLA. His science policy work focuses on combating climate change, environmental degradation, and loss of biodiversity by communicating science to voters and policymakers. The publication in JSPG by Connor and his co-authors is entitled Water in Los Angeles, Rethinking the Current Strategy. So Connor, can you tell us a little more about the policy issues that your memo seeks to address?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Yeah, a few others. There were 6 of us here from UCLA, graduate students from across disciplines, got together to write this memo because we all live in LA and we all need water, as does everybody else living in LA, and LA is a desert. So we need to be able to hold the water we have and get water sustainably from other places. For having close to 80% of the state's residents, we only get 25% of the state's annual rainfall. And we don't have massive swaths of underground potable water. So the current strategy by the county and the state is desalination and water imports coming from the Los Angeles water duct coming from the Colorado River. And that's not the best idea or the most sustainable process. Snow melt is becoming less and less every year over in Colorado, so there's less water available from that. A lot of that water goes to the Central Valley to grow the country's food. And so we were trying to think of, in LA County, what resources do we have that we can implement sustainably to get this water? And so using green spaces and urban engineering, we think that following that platform would allow us to capture and store more rainwater cleaner than something like desalination.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I imagine this is something that could be applicable to other similar climates as well. Do you think this is something that state government should address, or who are the stakeholders that would act on this?
Well, the stakeholders is every single person in Los Angeles. We all need water. We wrote this with Los Angeles County government, Los Angeles Board of Supervisors in mind to begin to implement these strategies. But this is a thing that all of California is affected by, the West Coast, the entire United States. So while we wrote it with LA County in mind, it's most certainly something depending on a few different strategies about how much water different areas have, but that could be implemented wide scale.
Yeah, great. That makes sense. So keeping with this theme, we'll move on to Sarah and discuss more of this as we go along. So Sarah Alexander is a PhD candidate in the Water System and Society Lab at Wisconsin-Madison with a minor in Life Sciences Communications. She holds a master's in Civil and Environmental Engineering from UW-Madison and a BA in Geology from Carleton College, and currently serves as the Policy Engagement Chair for the Catalyst for Science Policy. Sarah is passionate about increasing scientific literacy and fostering science-based policy to address critical societal challenges. The publication in JSPG by Sarah and her co-authors is entitled Green Infrastructure Incentives to Mitigate Flooding in Madison, Wisconsin. And Sarah, congratulations on your honorable mention. Can you tell us a little bit more about the issues in your memo related to flooding?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction and for having me. Our memo was really instigated by an event that my co-authors and I lived through a couple years ago in August of 2018 in Madison. We had a extreme rainfall event, which led to lots of flooding across Madison, estimated at like $154 million of damage. So, when we started to think about the topic we wanted to write our memo on, we were interested in doing something surrounding a changing climate and how Madison can better prepare itself to adapt to changing conditions. So, like many places, the climate is changing in Madison, and that's often in the form of more extreme precipitation events and that result in flooding that impact homes and businesses. And so we saw green infrastructure as one avenue for trying to address this problem. I think in Madison, a lot of the conversation has shifted around or been around the lake levels, which are managed. And, if we lowered the lake, then there would be more space to accommodate a heavy rainfall event. But homeowners are reluctant to lower the lake level and then have feet of shoreline and need to have really long docks. So it's a pretty contentious issue in Madison. And so we sort of wanted to sidestep around that and think about what other options at the local level there would be. So green infrastructure, provides a way for existing residential properties to be able to trap water so that they can either reuse it or to allow it to soak back into the ground instead of running off a hard surface like concrete. And so we came up with a few different recommendations, but primarily we thought the city could incentivize residents to develop green infrastructure on their property by some sort of grant program that would provide some of the upfront cost to incentivize residents to do so, and that this would also help green infrastructure be able to be implemented in some of the more low income areas, which tend to be more flood prone and lower lying near the lake.
Great, thank you so much for that intro. Yeah, that seems like a really important issue, and building off of what Connor mentioned also, it seems like both of your publications refer to this idea of engineering or infrastructure that would help address some of the issue that you're talking about. Can you discuss a little bit about the infrastructure that you envision for this?
Yeah, so there are lots of different green infrastructure practices. You've maybe seen some just walking around in different areas. You could install a rain garden, which is basically digging down and kind of creating a depression in a landscape alongside the side of a driveway, or maybe by the road, sort of, so that water running off the hard surface would be able to be captured in this garden, soak back into the ground and before it went down the storm sewer drain on the side of the road. People will put rain barrels in that can catch the water coming down the downspout off of their houses, and then use it to water plants. You can, put in other permeable pavement and try and, create more permeable surfaces on your landscape. And there are bigger projects that a city could implement too, but those are probably some of the key ones that a resident might choose to implement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just going back to Connor, since we're on this topic, so you mentioned urban engineering for your issues. So how does that look like for your publication?
Yeah, I mean, Sarah mentioned a few of these key ones, basically capturing any infrastructure that captures water and keeps it out of, basically separating your storm drains that may run into wastewater and collect in the same way, then basically water you can't use. So capturing, or whether that's at the house level, like Sarah just mentioned, whether that's at the community level, neighborhoods, or wide scale, using water that hits public streets and cycling them into different water reservoirs than necessarily stormwater would go into storm drains and become polluted. Yeah, like dry wells, retention basins. There's a lot of different infrastructure, whether small scale or large scale, that will capture water and store it instead of the 183 billion gallons that LA just runs straight to the ocean every year.
Yeah, that's very practical. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask that while we're on this topic. So we'll move on to our last speaker, Kathryn. Kathryn Pluta is a fourth-year PhD student in social and health psychology at Iowa State. Her current research focuses on the development and implementation of health behavior change, interventions related to physical activity, medication adherence, and diet. She holds a master's in social psychology from Iowa State and a BA in psychology from Brock University. The publication in JSPG by Kathryn and her co-authors is entitled From Cafeteria to Community, Amending the National School Lunch Act to Promote Healthy Eating in Children. So Kathryn, can you tell us a little more about your publication?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So our policy memo was actually born out of a few graduate students getting together from different disciplines, and this was the crossroads at which we are all passionate about, coming from different backgrounds. So we have a couple students, myself and Kimberly, who are psychology students with focusing on health behavior change, and others from nutrition, and another from policy and law. And the National School Lunch Act is something that we're all really passionate about. So our focus was to advocate for amending current policies to foster long-term health behavior change, specifically when it comes to making good, healthy food choices among children to mitigate the obesity epidemic. So providing school lunches to children that might not otherwise have healthy foods available to them is a great first step, and especially when it comes to educating children to make healthy choices in the cafeteria. But this approach only goes so far. Are children going to continue making healthy food choices when they're at home for dinner, or at home for the weekend, or at home for the summer? Likely not. And even if we are educating children about making these choices, we also need to educate their caregivers and their parents, because after all, children model their food choices largely after those who they look up to and those who are feeding them. So not only educating students at school, but also educating their parents and caregivers about how to quickly and easily make healthy foods, how to develop healthy habits when it comes to making healthy food choices at home is extremely important. So not only involving the children, but also involving the community. So some of the things that we propose could make a lasting change in these communities is developing community gardens, making cooking classes accessible for very low or no cost to community members, and really promoting educational activities that both parents and children can engage in together. So not only is this a very enjoyable experience, hopefully, but also they're making those learning connections about how to prepare healthy foods and make those choices together. Additionally, the role of the environment is monumental when it comes to behavior change, because behavior change is very hard to do. So building an infrastructure within communities, particularly those that are relatively disadvantaged, to make healthy food options more accessible. So for an example, low-income areas, a lot of the individuals that live in them cannot either access or afford fresh produce. Maybe it's not accessible within miles and miles. So obviously they will not purchase it if they can't afford it or they can't access it. So by building this infrastructure through equitable partnerships between schools, local businesses, nonprofits, within the communities to make healthy food options both accessible and affordable, and coupling that with education of both children and caregivers could really make a difference for long-lasting behavior change when it comes to making healthy food choices, and hopefully also mitigating the obesity epidemic.
Yes, thank you for that important issue. It seems like there's a lot of angles here, and I'm glad you brought up the idea of infrastructure and community as well. I think that's something that is common to all of your publications here. So I'm curious about your, I think education is something that is really important in all of these topics. Can you describe a little more about what type of education would help?
Absolutely. So currently in schools, in congruence with the current policies that are in place, there is not a lot of consistency across education programs with regards to nutrition in schools today. One of the things that we proposed is making a standardized nutrition component that is implemented in all public school curricula. That would also entail bringing in certified nutritionists to provide this education to the children. Because right now it's the burden of the teachers who are already overworked, underpaid, don't have time to implement all of these new aspects into their curricula. So by bringing in outside people who are well-trained, well-versed in these areas would be the first step. Also, not only educating children in this manner, but also providing such opportunities for education from certified professionals to the adults in the community as well, and making those classes both accessible and affordable, I think is a very important step.
Yes, I would agree. Thank you for that. The other thing you mentioned is addressing specifically disadvantaged populations. Is there something that could be done for them specifically, or are they more affected by this? And then I'll ask you, the other speakers, the same question.
Sure. So a lot of schools in which these lunch acts are focused on are particularly in disadvantaged communities where children might not otherwise have access to healthy foods beyond what they get at school for lunch. So a lot of our thinking behind this memo was focused at targeting these disadvantaged communities and really building the infrastructure in those communities first, because in our opinion, they're the ones that need it the most, especially those where healthy foods aren't accessible. And even if they are, they're not affordable. So really attacking it from a community level and building that infrastructure that would afford individuals to change their behavior through the environmental changes that would occur.
And then I guess start with Connor. So same question, and for Sarah as well. How can we, so first of all, are certain populations more affected by the issues that you're discussing, and how can we increase or make that more equitable?
Yeah, environmental justice is a big issue in Los Angeles and across the United States. Disadvantaged, disenfranchised communities who may be working class or have that communities that Los Angeles has looked over are the ones at the brunt end of having clean, accessible water. And so ensuring that these green spaces, these urban water capture programs are implemented in these communities first to make sure we can make water access more equitable across Los Angeles and California is extremely important.
Great, thank you for that point. And Sarah?
Yeah, so in Madison, many underrepresented and lower income groups live on the south and east sides of the city. And these are lower lying areas relative to the rest of Madison and the rest of the isthmus. So they're close to the lakes, which means they're especially vulnerable to flooding. So certainly, flooding has the potential to impact these communities more than some of the other suburbs and outlying areas. So, this was really forefront in us choosing to recommend that Madison implement a grant program, because these communities often may not have the money around and available to be able to think about implementing green infrastructure on the properties, and many also are multi-unit housing that are not necessarily owned by these residents. And so being able to use this program to target those areas specifically, because that is where the resources are needed, but also because they're bearing the brunt of the cost, or I guess effect.
Yeah, that's really important. I like your point about some of the solutions that exist here, because I think some of this comes down to how do we effectively address this in the sense of different methods. So one thing, going back to Kathryn, because it seems like all these topics somewhat come back to what Connor mentioned, environmental justice and more equitability. So if we're talking about policy making, how can we make good, useful policies to address the issues that you're working on? So maybe Kathryn, if you can comment.
Sure. So I think for us, it would start at testing behavioral interventions, particularly when it comes to the educational component, the behavior change component. Health behavior change, like I alluded to before, is very complex, and there are so many different factors that play into whether someone who is trying to change their behavior long-term ends up being successful or not. So particularly identifying specific populations, their environmental context, their socioeconomical context, their backgrounds, individual differences, all of these things play into how well certain interventions will work for certain populations. So by firstly going in and creating these interventions, testing them rigorously, and identifying what components are most effective at fostering behavior change in these populations, that would be where we should begin, in my opinion, and then implement those through advocating for policy changes that would supplement these health behavior change intervention techniques.
Great, that's really helpful. Yeah, I think it's really important to think about how to impact this at the policy level and who the different stakeholders are, especially when it comes to education. So going back to Connor, thinking more broadly now about, I think what you mentioned about this issue of environmental justice is, I think it's a very important issue, and I could see a lot of early career researchers who might want to engage in this and work on this type of policy. Do you have any advice for them in terms of starting, or where to look for information and how to engage in this policy topic?
Yeah, there's a lot of people talking about water in Los Angeles, but environmental justice extends far beyond just water. It's the number of trucks driving down your street. It's the pollution in your air, the oil seeping through your backyard. So there are a lot of organizations working on this. A quick Google search will make a lot pop up. But engage your local representatives. We had a new, today's Tuesday, yesterday, just on Monday, we had a new district attorney formally installed here in Los Angeles, and George Gascon, is going to focus on environmental justice. Get engaged with his office. They're going to begin prosecuting these polluters who are the root cause of this injustice environmentally. So get engaged with your local representatives. I think that's the most impactful way to take any of the memos we wrote here, or any one idea you may have, and try to do good for your community.
Yes, I agree. That's really good advice. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I would just encourage folks to learn more about their communities and what some of the issues really are. I mean, I think one thing in thinking about how we're going to design good policies to solve some of these issues is that we need to be engaging the communities in designing these policies, and really listen and understand what their needs are. Because I think if people on the ground living in the communities know what the key issues are and what some of the problems they're facing. And so, as much as you can just sort of learn about the place where you are and try and get a grasp of what some of the key issues are, then I think that's a good jumping off point to, if you want to get involved in policy, think about, where, at what level you might be able to enact change, and what kinds of solutions might be needed. I think early career researchers are, we're good at researching and taking lots of information and distilling it down into, key information and points. And so I think there's a real opportunity for us to engage in policy.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a good segue to sort of the last question here about more practical steps. So now that you wrote the memo, what are you thinking about what the next steps are, and how do you see some of this being implemented? Whoever wants to start.
Yeah, I guess I can go. Next steps, we want to continue to kind of dive in to local data in the literature here in LA to find what places would be best suited to start these what environmental justice communities, if we would pitch a pilot program for this, which one would we target? Because we want to go to legislators with more pointed information, not just, hey, you're doing it wrong, this is what the science says, do it this way. We want to go and actually foster a relationship with them and try to bring proposals forward that are like implementing our science with practical policy.
Great. And then Sarah?
Yeah, so we're hoping to work with the city of Madison. We have just heard that they recently started a green infrastructure pilot program for about 600 homes in the city, which they're funding 80 to 100% of the cost of. So we're hoping that they see good results from that pilot program, but that this is maybe an opportunity to work with them, share our memo and suggest how we could build this into a larger program that would be more citywide. And continuing to also engage with the legislature and meet with different offices to see how these can be priorities in the upcoming legislative session.
I agree. Yeah, thanks. That makes sense. And Kathryn?
Yeah, and just to echo the pilot program, I completely agree that starting out with a small subset in which we can test some of these strategies that we're hoping to implement is definitely where we are planning to begin. Currently, a lot of the research that I'm working on is looking at health behavior change strategies and which ones work better for certain populations in certain contexts. So just advancing that science regarding interventions and particularly educational components that could be implemented in a very cost and time effective way before we move forward and actually go into the community and try to implement some of these and identify the best way to go forward with this, and then also making sure that we're starting to build those connections within the community with businesses, schools, nonprofits, and just getting the wheels turning in that regard as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great point to end on. I think in terms of community engagement and different stakeholders interconnected. So thank you. Thanks to our speakers for joining today, and thanks to all of our listeners. You can find this episode and others like it on JSPG's YouTube channel and on SoundCloud. And that's it for this week on SciPol SoundBites, the podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SciPol Journal.